Today is early April 9th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to go to the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map, so keep that in mind when we take a look at it. And as we zoom in, looking at the line of contact, we'll notice a lot of the fighting is still in the Donbas region. We see a lot of fighting around Avdiivka. And again, if you look here, they're talking about, and this is a pro-Ukrainian live map, they're talking about Russian military aviation carrying out precision strikes in Avdiivka. And this goes back to the glide bombs that I was talking about in a recent video. That is going to continue all along the line of contact. That will most likely actually increase. And then if we look at Bakhmut, since my last update, there has been a huge amount of change. As we can see to the east bank of the Bakhmutka River, Russia had been holding that for quite a while. Now they control the entire west bank of the river, and they've actually moved into the center of the city. What's left is the rail station and this western part here, and then Bakhmut is completely controlled by Russia. And if you zoom out, what you notice is that this front line is going to be straightened out. And that's going to be important ahead of whatever the Ukrainian offensive is going to be. We keep hearing that it's going to be launched in the south toward Melitopol. Most likely, we see strikes being carried out against Melitopol by Ukraine, most likely multiple launch rocket systems like the HIMARS. They're claiming that Ukraine is going to strike southward and try to cut this land bridge from Crimea. And again, that is quite a distance to move, considering the layered defenses that Russia has created over months now in this area. Once they reach Melitopol, what will be left of their military? I don't know, but I just want to allow for the possibility that Ukraine could launch the offensive entirely someplace else where they feel Russian defenses are weaker, or they might launch it in multiple places. I just want people to keep that possibility in mind as we wait for the offensive to begin. We remember in fall last year, there was the Kharkov offensive, there was the Kherson offensive, and they were on two opposite sides of the line of contact. And the Kharkov offensive was striking at an area that Russia had poorly defended. There were hardly any Russian forces there at all, and Ukrainian forces just sort of moved in to where Russian forces were simply not. They were not there in large numbers. They withdrew. They were unable to stop the advance of the Ukrainian forces, the few troops that were there. And one thing that worked in Russia's benefit was now you have large amounts of Ukrainian forces operating out in the open, and Russia could use its long-range firepower to strike at them and destroy them in large numbers. Probably between 1 and 3 brigades were lost around Kharkov, and then Kherson. There was actually a significant Russian presence there. They stood and they fought, and they took out multiple brigades worth of men and machines there around Kherson. And ultimately, Ukraine never broke through Russian defenses. Russia made the decision to evacuate to the east bank of the Dnieper River, because when you looked at the map, it was almost a separate war. And at that time, Russia wanted to consolidate the line of contact, and they did not want this essentially a separate theater on the other side of the Dnieper River. They wanted to consolidate everything on one side and concentrate their attention there. So that's what happened in the fall. That something similar to that could happen now. Not much has changed for Ukraine since then, and it stands to reason that they're going to attempt to wage an offensive strategy in a very similar manner. Now, I'm going to talk more about the Ukrainian offensive in just a bit, but let's talk about the preparations for it, the weapon systems that the US and Europe continue pouring into Ukraine. And we're hearing claims that a lot of what Ukraine said it needed and what was pledged to Ukraine is not actually going to be getting there anytime soon. And I have heard that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed that the Ukrainian offensive will begin between 2 and 3 weeks. I have no idea why you would announce something like this if it is actually going to unfold in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But if it were to, a lot of the equipment pledged to Ukraine is simply not going to make it on time. And I want to take a look at this. This is dated April 4th. This is from the U.S. Department of Defense. Biden administration announces additional security assistance for Ukraine. And again, it is a list of weapons and munitions and vehicles that the U.S. is taking out of inventory. That is this list right here. And then down here, USAI, these are contracts that the Department of Defense will sign with manufacturers and have all of this manufactured and sent to Ukraine. And as you can see, the list is almost exactly twice as long as what they will be taking from inventories. And if you've been following my videos on the conflict in Ukraine over the last year, you will realize that this is almost exactly the opposite of how it used to be. The vast majority of what the US was sending to Ukraine came from existing inventories, and only a small percentage of additional systems were contracted with the defense contractors to then be manufactured and sent to Ukraine at a later date. And it's very important to realize that. What we see on the second part of this list, this very long second part of the list, that is not going to get to Ukraine. It could take weeks, months, maybe even years for some of this to get there. So let's go through some of these items. Well, actually, let's go through all of these items. So the first, and now this first part of the list is from existing inventories. Additional munitions for Patriot air defense systems. There was a critical shortage of Patriot interceptors before the conflict in Ukraine even began. There was a critical shortage. They're in demand everywhere. Saudi Arabia had been using them extensively to defend against missiles and drones flying out of Yemen. That conflict has cooled off, but there's still a backlog of missiles that need to be built and sent to replenish stockpiles around the globe. And the Patriot air defense system really hadn't performed all that spectacularly against the threats that Ukraine specifically faces. Again, missiles and drones. Next on the list is additional ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket system. They're talking about HIMARS, and again, there are critical shortages for that now because the U.S. has sent a certain number of launchers. They don't want to send any more launchers. That is something that they have actually created a contract for. That will take years to reach Ukraine. And now the guided rockets launched by HIMARS, that is also in short supply. They can continue sending them small amounts of these rockets as they have been almost indefinitely, but they cannot surge a large number of rockets to Ukraine. If they do, then there will be a critical shortage that will take years to solve. Just like with the Stinger and the Javelin. Also listed is 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds. There are critical shortages of this as well. I think I might have mentioned that once or twice. And the 105 millimeter artillery shells are being sent specifically because of the critical shortage of 155 millimeter artillery rounds and also howitzers to fire them. They also list 120 millimeter mortar rounds. This is something they used to list a quantity for. They no longer do. You have to wonder why that is. Is it because they're surging huge amounts of them to Ukraine right now, or is it because there's just so few of them they don't want to put a number there because it's embarrassing and the public will demand answers? 120 millimeter and 105 millimeter tank ammunition. Now, 120 millimeter, that would be for things like the Challenger, the Leopard 2, the M1 Abrams. 105 millimeter would be for things like the Leopard 1, the French AMX 10 RC, and the Leopard 1 and the AMX 10 RC. They use two different types of 105 millimeter tank ammunition, and the Challenger 2 uses 120 millimeter tank ammunition, but it's for a rifled gun, so it's completely different than what the Leopard 2 and the M1 Abrams uses. So this is all munitions, a variety of munitions that the U.S. has to send, the U.S. and its allies have to send to Ukraine for them to be able to use this variety of tanks that they've been given. And again, military wants one main battle tank on the battlefield so they can simplify and streamline logistics, maintenance, training, and everything else. And what the U.S. and NATO have done is the opposite. They have sent a huge number of vehicles fulfilling the one single role of main battle tank, and they have this complex logistical challenge that they now face, and it is going to inhibit effectiveness on the battlefield for Ukraine. There's no way it will not. 25 millimeter ammunition. This is most likely for the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. Its gun is a 25 millimeter gun. They also have tube launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missiles. TOW missile. This is the TOW missile. If you've ever seen a TOW missile, it's a bit cumbersome. It is not nearly as portable as, say, a Javelin or an NLAW. Now, they are also mounted on the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, and that may be what these are for. They sent huge numbers of these to Syria, these militants and terrorists that the U.S. was backing in its proxy war against the Syrian government there. It failed to turn the tide there. I highly doubt that it's going to turn the tide in Ukraine. And by the way, the TOW missile was included in the list of anti-tank weapons mentioned in that paper that I've brought up many times from Fort Benning, U.S. Army Fort Benning, where they talk about how trained U.S. personnel were hitting tanks only 19% of the time for a variety of reasons that need to be addressed with additional training. And so if that was the problem that already trained U.S. troops were having, what do you think the situation is going to be for Ukrainians who have to learn how to use these from square one? Approximately 400 grenade launchers and 200,000 rounds of ammunition. And these numbers sound large, but when you look at a map, how big the battlefield is, this is a drop in the bucket. It really is the U.S. just scraping together anything it can find and send, and it's clearly not nearly enough. Next, 11 tactical vehicles to recover equipment. This is essential. If you don't want to lose that tank completely because it broke down, you need to recover it as quickly as possible. They're going to be sending 11 tactical vehicles to recover equipment along a line of contact almost 1,000 kilometers long. 61 heavy fuel tanks, 10 trucks, and 10 trailers to transport heavy equipment. Again, we're talking about a conflict unfolding on a massive scale along a line of contact 1,000 kilometers or more long. And they're talking about 10 trucks and 10 trailers. And you have to remember that Ukraine and Russia both attempt to move the vast majority of troops, equipment, ammunition by rail. But Russia has been attacking the Ukrainian power grid. The power grid is what makes rail transportation possible across Ukraine. And so you're going to need many more of these trucks to compensate for that. You cannot drive a Challenger 2 tank from the border between Poland and Ukraine all the way to the Donbas or all the way to Zaporozhye. You cannot. You have to put it on a flatbed. You have to transport the majority of the way, and it operates on its own, under its own power when it's actually on the battlefield fighting. Or else it'll break down. The engine will have to get changed out before it even reaches the battlefield. It'll be right on its way back to Poland. You'll need a truck to do that anyway. Testing and diagnostic equipment to support vehicle maintenance and repair. And this can mean a large number of things. When I was in the U.S. Marines, we had a variety of equipment that we'd actually connect to, say, the M1 Abrams tank to troubleshoot the fire control system. But that takes a lot of training. I took a 9-month training course. I've heard that since then they've condensed it to maybe 6 months, but it takes months to do that. And even then, you're just barely able to figure out what's wrong with it. And then you still need to send it to a higher echelon shop, again, likely in Poland, 1,000 kilometers away, and someone there will have to fix it. So again, this is a reoccurring theme that you see play out with every single item listed on this list. Now, then it says spare parts and other field equipment, a very general term, not much we can get from that. Obviously, that is something every military requires. Obviously, for Ukraine, it's complicated because of the vast variety of equipment that they are getting transferred over to them and the lack of standardization. Now we come to USAI, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And this means contracts for these things to be made, manufactured, and then sent to Ukraine. So additional munitions for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, NASAMS. We were hearing a lot about NASAMS. We haven't heard much about it since it was sent to Ukraine and since it's being used, but apparently they are in need of additional munitions. Now, it was my understanding that NASAMS was able to use existing stockpiles of a variety of air-to-air missiles. And if that was the case, you would not really expect the US to want to contract this out. There would be no necessity to do that unless they're using so many missiles so quickly that their stockpiles are in danger of dropping. And also the fact that the US wants to use these air-to-air missiles against a war that it's trying to provoke with China right now. So that's actually interesting that they would need more missiles for NASAMS. They also say 9 counter-unmanned aerial system 30mm gun trucks. And I don't know what these are specifically, but it could just be a 30mm gun attached to the back of a truck. It sounds similar to the German Gepard. I've talked about how few of these were sent and how vast Ukraine's airspace actually is. And the fact that nine trucks, again, for a country the size of Ukraine, what is this going to allow Ukraine to protect? Maybe some key areas in Kiev, and that's it. It's not going to be nearly enough to provide force protection across, again, a line of contact hundreds of kilometers long, and it's not going to even be able to provide protection for other essential cities and infrastructure across Ukraine. 10 mobile CUAS laser-guided rocket system, CUAS, counter-unmanned aerial system, laser-guided rockets. And there's a Newsweek article here that talks a little bit about this. What are CUAS laser-guided rocket systems? Kiev gets experimental weaponry. That's what you want in the middle of an intense, protracted war. You want experimental weapons that have never been used before. It says the CUAS laser-guided rocket systems are being sent to combat unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. They are a new item to be provided to Ukraine by the US, the senior defense official said, and are important capabilities for air defense and to counter Russian unmanned aerial systems. And if it's on this list, the USAI list, that means that they haven't been built. They're not being drawn from existing stockpiles. They have to be made and then sent to Ukraine. And Ukrainians have to be trained to use them. It also says the US has previously provided a counter-unmanned aerial system known as the Vampire to Ukraine, which uses small missiles essentially to shoot UAVs out of the sky, Colin Kahl, US Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, told the media in August. And I remember talking about the Vampire, how few of them they were going to send and how dubious it was that they would be effective. And we haven't heard anything about them since. And it looks like if they're sending this new system, this experimental system to Ukraine, instead of more Vampire systems, then maybe the Vampire system didn't really work. And now they're going to send this. 3 air surveillance radars. Russia is continuously, not just continuously destroying these radars, but there are videos of these radars being destroyed. These aerial surveillance radars and also counter battery radars, which are so essential for modern artillery duels. Their air surveillance radars are obviously searching for Russian warplanes. And if you take these out, you're inhibiting your ability to defend yourself against airstrikes. And the counter battery radars are to see where Russian artillery pieces are firing from, so you can direct your own fire toward them and destroy their positions. And without these radars, you are blind on the battlefield. Russia has plenty of their own radars, and it just makes the fighting so much more lopsided in Russia's favor. These radars take a long time to build, and this is another item that is on the to build list. And then there is a whole variety of munitions: 30 millimeter and 23 millimeter anti-aircraft ammunition, 130 millimeter and 122 millimeter artillery rounds, 122 millimeter Grad rockets for Soviet era multiple launch rocket systems, rocket launchers and ammunition, they don't specify what, 120 millimeter and 81 millimeter mortar systems, so the actual mortar systems themselves, 120 millimeter, 81 millimeter, and 60 millimeter mortar rounds, and 120 millimeter tank ammunition. So they're drawing 120 millimeter tank ammunition from existing stockpiles. They're also ordering more from industry, and these are all essential munitions. And if you are running out of these and you need to order more because your stockpiles have been depleted and your military industrial output is so deficient, that is a very serious problem for not only Ukraine but their Western sponsors as well. It's an illustration of how anemic the West's collective military industrial output actually has become. Also listed are Javelin anti-armor systems. There's already a multi-year backlog of orders just to replace what the US has sent to Ukraine, and now this will be on top of that back order. Anti-armor rockets, this was another munition that they constantly listed. They never said exactly what it was, but apparently they're out of those too. Now they have to order more. Approximately 3,600 small arms and more than 23 million rounds of small arms ammunition. 3,600 small arms is not even enough for a single brigade, and 23 million rounds sounds like a lot, but when you realize it could take up to 250,000 rounds just to kill one enemy combatant, then that kind of puts it into perspective. And again, these are things that are so basic. If you're running out of these things in a war, you need to order more from industry. That is a serious problem. And Ukraine is in a serious problem right now, serious situation. 7 tactical vehicles to recover equipment. Well, we were just talking about how many you actually need to try to prevent the complete loss of damaged or broken down vehicles on the battlefield. This is just 7 more. And I would say maybe 1 or 2 Russian battalion tactical groups would have about 7 of these. And they have over 100 battalion tactical groups in Ukraine alone right now. 8 heavy fuel tankers and 105 fuel trailers. Obviously something that's extremely essential. It's on the list of things to build and send to Ukraine. What is the time frame we're talking here? And isn't that something that they desperately would need right now ahead of their offensive? Their offensive is going to be unfolding in the next between 2 and 3 weeks. These most likely aren't going to arrive, and you're not going to be able to train Ukrainians to do it efficiently in time. Armored bridging systems. Again, when is the offensive? And when will these actually be ready and sent to Ukraine? 4 logistics support vehicles. 4 logistics support vehicles in a conflict of this scale. Trucks and 10 trailers to transport heavy equipment. So again, on top of the ones that they included in the other list. Secure communication equipment, SATCOM terminals and services. These are things that could take, if it's anything like the radars, it could take half a year or longer to make them in the numbers required for Ukraine. And then also funding for training, maintenance, and sustainment. It cannot be stressed enough how Ukraine needs vastly larger quantities of all of these things to continue just losing at the pace that it's losing right now. And people are saying, well, Brian, what if Ukraine gains territory in this upcoming offensive? Well, they're still losing because this is a war of attrition. It is not a war of territorial conquest. They are losing at a rate that the US and its allies are unable to maintain. let alone matching or exceeding the firepower and logistical flow of supplies and everything else onto the battlefield that Russia has at its disposal. This is a huge problem. This is a long-term, protracted, and intense conflict that the collective West was not prepared for, Ukraine was not prepared for, Russia was prepared for. There is a Washington Post article about this arms package right here. U.S. is providing Ukraine with $2.6 billion in military aid. Wow, that sounds like a lot until you come down here and you read that the U.S. will send Ukraine about $500 million in ammunition and equipment and spend more than $2 billion to buy an array of munitions, radar, and new weapons to help Kiev counter drones in the coming months, the Pentagon said. The Ukrainian troops are gearing up for their spring offensive against Russian forces. The article also says the defense official said weapons already bought using the security assistance funding in previous packages are beginning to make their way to the battlefield. That is key because in some cases, such as with 155mm rounds, the Pentagon has been sending its own stocks, which are also needed for American troops training. And there is a finite supply. Now, the official said, the deliveries of 155mm rounds Ukraine is getting include ammunition that was bought a number of months ago through the USAI program. But we already know what the production numbers are for US 155mm artillery rounds. It's somewhere around 22,000 a month. And if Ukraine is firing between 4,000 and 6,000 rounds per day, that means they have enough for maybe half a week, maybe one business week. They get the weekend off. That's where they are with artillery ammunition, and this has primarily been an artillery war. So that's the Washington Post talking about this. And then here comes the New York Times. Stating the obvious. New weapons aren't enough. The challenges of Ukraine's coming assault. And then down here it says, with powerful Western weapons, newly formed assault units, and even a reconstituted Azov battalion, Ukraine is poised for a crucial spring counteroffensive, but overcoming casualties and keeping war-weary troops motivated will be stern tests. Azov, these are literally Nazis. They're Nazis. And if you scroll down, they have pictures of Azov. Here they are. And they still have Nazi insignia all over their uniforms. Even the uniforms they wear to do physical training have Nazi insignia on them. Here, they identify them as recruits in the Azov regiment, and they're getting out of U.S. armored vehicles. So the U.S., who had previously prohibited any weapons or money getting into the hands of Azov because they're Nazis, now they're openly using U.S. vehicles supplied by the U.S. government. And you just keep scrolling down. There's more pictures of Azov. This is Azov training. And here's one of the commanders training them. And he has the Nazi Wolf's Angle right there on his uniform. And that is a NATO standard rifle right there. And here is a picture they claim are of Azov recruits, and they all have NATO style rifles with them. So not literal Nazis. This is what the New York Times is cheering on here. They never mention the fact that they're Nazis anywhere in the article. The US government had prohibited weapons and money from getting into their hands previously. Now they're obviously making an exception. This is what the West is cheering on and sending arms to and hoping Nazis prevail on a battlefield. That's where the West is right now. That is desperation. The article goes on and it says new Western weapons that could prove critical in assaults like German Leopard 2 tanks and American mine-clearing vehicles are arriving in Ukraine. Thousands of recruits are training in newly constituted units tailored for offensives, and the military command is holding back elite soldiers from the worst of the fighting in the east, in and around the city of Bakhmut, to throw them instead into the coming campaign. We've talked about that, haven't we? I'll get into that in just a moment. The new Ukrainian campaign, when it comes, will be a test of its army's ability to rearm and reconstitute battalions while maintaining the motivation and maneuvering skills that gave it an edge in 3 previous counteroffensives. Well, we know about Kharkov and Kherson. In Kharkov, there were no Russian troops there. And in Kherson, they failed to break through, and they hemorrhaged multiple brigades worth of men and machines. That's a single brigade is around 4,000 at full strength. And then they only got to the city when Russia had already withdrawn. So that bodes very poorly. If that's the metric you want to measure the potential success of an upcoming offensive, that does not bode well for Ukraine. Now, that's all true. It really will be a test of all of those things. But let's think about what Ukraine has done since the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022. That initial Ukrainian military that faced the Russians, that was the result of between 8 and 9 years of NATO training and arms shipments. And that was done over a long period of time, multiple years, and was plenty of time for them to incorporate these new systems, train on them, and gain experience using them. And at the time, they were killing Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine. That army has since been completely destroyed. And even U.S. analysts admit that all of the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers that NATO had trained over all of those years, they're all gone. So they began building a new army ahead of the fall offensives last year. That army now is also gone. What are they waiting for? What is this article talking about? They're talking about building yet a third army to go on the offensive against Russia. And they've condensed the training down into shorter time periods, and they're being given a larger and larger amount of equipment they are unfamiliar with. That is how this offensive differs from the previous one in the fall. I've talked about this extensively, the problems that Ukraine is going to face this offensive. In the previous offensives, they still were mostly using Soviet-era equipment. It was not their own equipment that had all been destroyed. It was a mix of their own equipment and also primarily Soviet-era equipment coming from Eastern European NATO members. And they were using tanks like the T-72 that they had experience using. Now they're going to be given more T-72s, also Challenger 2s, Leopard 2s, Leopard 1s, the French AMX-10 RC, which is a wheeled light tank. It's not really a tank. And eventually the M1 Abrams. They all use different ammunition, even if they have the same size gun, but they all use different ammunition. They require different maintenance for different types of engines and all different spare parts. They all have entirely different optics and fire control systems, so all of that has to be repaired and dealt with separately. And the list goes on and on and on. And the same goes for all of these armored vehicles that they're getting. Soviet-era systems, hodgepodge of armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and other armored combat vehicles from all across the West. And then you take all of these systems that are meant to perform just one specific role, but you have a variety of systems. You are compounding all of your logistical challenges. It would be hard enough to sustain any kind of army in this type of conflict in the first place. You vastly complicated it by adding in all of these varieties of weapons and vehicles. They're also talking about shorter training, 5 weeks. That's what the Azov Nazi is spending to train the Azov, the next generation. 5 weeks of training. And to give you a point of reference, an entry-level U.S. Marine, an infantryman, gets about 5 months of initial training. They're condensing this all down into 5 weeks. All of that said, I have repeatedly said this, and I will say it again. No one should underestimate Ukraine's counteroffensive. Ukraine and NATO are going to throw absolutely everything they have into this counteroffensive. We know that Russian forces have consistently traded short-term political considerations for a long-term strategic victory, and that includes giving up territory if they feel they're going to suffer large numbers of casualties, or if they feel they may be encircled or cut off from the main group, they will give up territory and they will withdraw, and Ukraine will gain that territory. However, by doing so, they preserve their combat power while eliminating Ukraine. So at the end of the Ukrainian offensive, no matter where it ends on the map, Ukrainian forces are going to be exhausted. They're going to have to wait for a new army to be sent to them by NATO, and Russia will have preserved its combat power. And we've watched this cycle happen already, and we can see how each time Ukraine emerges weaker and weaker. And there are problems that add up over this entire time. It is not actually a cycle where it goes back to the beginning. There are systemic problems that just continuously add up as we go along. And the New York Times talks about the lack of trained manpower, low morale. These are things that are just going to get worse for Ukraine. It's ultimately a war of attrition. So I say do not underestimate what the Ukrainian offensive can achieve in terms of territorial gains, but they will do so at the expense of trained manpower and equipment that's now at this point cannot be replaced by the West. The New York Times goes on and says the timing is critical. Success for Ukraine in the battles of the southeastern plains would drive home to the world the declining military might of Russia, ease concerns that the war has settled into a quagmire, and most likely encourage Ukraine's allies to further arm and finance Kiev in the war. All of these are political goals. None of these are strategic. None of these actually will end the conflict in Ukraine's favor. And the last part about encouraging Ukraine's allies to further arm and finance Kiev. With what? With what? It goes on and it says, Western support has been solid so far, but is not guaranteed. The U.S. budget for military assistance, for example, is now expected to run out by around September. And a senior American defense official recently described the latest tranche of artillery rounds and rockets sent to Ukraine as a last-ditch effort. And that's not because they are tired of this proxy war. It's their proxy war. They would like it to go on for as long as possible. They would like for it to be as successful as possible. The reality, however, is that the West's military industrial output simply cannot sustain this conflict any longer. It is a last-ditch effort, period. No matter how successful Ukraine is, at the end of it, the West cannot replace their losses. New York Times continues. It says Ukrainian officers will have to choreograph artillery, infantry, and armored vehicle assaults that crash through Russian trenches, tank traps, and minefields. In the south, Russian units have been building defensive positions since they were pushed out of Kherson region in November. Sophisticated Western tanks with better survivability and firepower will be critical in uprooting those positions. Maybe better survivability and firepower than whatever Ukraine's been using up to this point. The fact that they're not properly trained on it may in many ways mitigate those advantages, but they most certainly are not more survivable and have better firepower than modern Russian main battle tanks, and certainly not the actual weapon systems Russia will be using to target and destroy these tanks, which will mostly be artillery and anti-tank weapons. And we remember during the Kherson offensive last fall, Russia did not have time to make such extensive defensive positions. They did have some to a certain extent, and even with that, they were able to destroy brigades worth of men and machines around Kherson, and only until their commanders made the decision to cross the river was Ukraine able to take Kherson city. There was no breakthrough, and there most likely wouldn't have been if Russia continued investing in that front. They saw any value or logic in doing so. They did not. Now, Russia still has huge numbers of men and machines, and they also have this extensive layered defense network. I will show the article again from the New York Times, defenses carved into the earth, just to get an idea of what they're talking about. They're talking about trenches, dragon's teeth, more trenches, vehicle obstacles. There are layers of them, and they stretch for kilometers in all directions. And they're located in the south around Kherson and Zaporozhye, just north of Crimea, and also Popasnaya, which is east of Bakhmut. And they show pictures here, photos, and also a diagram to simplify it. This is what Ukraine will be going up against. And these are defenses that Russia did not have when they were fending off Ukraine's Kherson offensive last fall. The New York Times goes on and it says, preparing for the counteroffensive has come at a cost. Russia has used convicts and mercenaries to wear down the enemy in the months-long fight at Bakhmut, stretching Ukraine's exhausted, battered soldiers to the limit. Ukraine has tried to avoid taking the bait, deploying volunteer territorial defense units and delaying rotations, although I have been hearing from both sides that Ukraine's best troops have also been committed to Bakhmut. Now, whether they took anything from the upcoming offensive, that's a different story. I suspect that they haven't, and that's what they're talking about. And this is something that I've mentioned. If there is a major Ukrainian offensive around Bakhmut to break the encirclement and to keep hold of the city, that's going to require men and machines that are being prepared for this major spring offensive that they've been talking about. And in that case, they will be drawing forces off of preparations for that main offensive, and that will blunt and diminish the combat potential, the offensive potential. The New York Times is claiming they didn't end up sending their best units. They just rounded up anyone who could hold a gun and they sent them there. But conversely, Russia had the Wagner group fighting around Bakhmut. It's a private military company. The vast majority of the 350,000 reservists Russia mobilized late last year, they have not been committed anywhere along the line of contact. They most likely will be the soldiers who first blunt the Ukrainian offensive and then go on counteroffensive. And by that I mean continuing the war of attrition. I don't think there's going to be any Russian big arrow offensives until the fighting capacity of Ukraine clearly and almost completely collapses. Then the New York Times starts talking about the offensive itself. It says, the counteroffensive Ukraine is likely to launch intensive artillery bombardments along a narrow stretch of front line, military analysts say, followed by demining teams and tank assaults. Ukraine is widely expected to strike in the south, where the terrain ranges from wide open farm fields with only sparse tree lines for cover to towns and villages. Sounds very similar to the terrain around Kherson. And this idea of concentrating firepower in a narrow area along the front, this is what I have repeatedly explained Ukraine has to do because they lack the long-range firepower, both in quantity and quality, that Russia has. They have to concentrate everything in a narrow area of the front line. They have to move across the battlefield dispersed in this area, and they have to try to overwhelm Russia's firepower, their ability to destroy all of these units before some of them reach Russian positions and start inflicting losses on them. It goes on and it says, a thrust of about 50 miles over the steppe from the current front lines to the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol would split Russian-held territory into two zones, sever supply lines, and put Ukrainian artillery within range of Russian bases on the Crimean Peninsula. Preparing new recruits to replace dead, wounded, and exhausted soldiers has been taking place for months. Tens of thousands of new recruits have undergone training in Europe and inside Ukraine, including in newly formed offensive guard units. About 35,000 Ukrainians have signed up for the assault units. And that could happen. I've talked about how Ukraine most likely is going to gain territory, possibly even a significant amount of territory. I've talked about how they're likely getting more 155 millimeter artillery rounds now than they have ever gotten. What the US and EU are doing is depleting their existing stockpiles and just sending everything they have for one last shot. But once that is gone, it's gone. It will be years before they have that amount of artillery shells laying around again. So it is, once again, it is a last-ditch effort, and they're going to throw absolutely everything they have at Russia. But they reached Melitopol Out of 35,000 soldiers, and that's if they are all committed in one place and not into 2 or more different places, how many of them are still going to be around? How much ammunition is going to be on hand? Again, the artillery rounds, they have enough for a couple of months of intense combat, and then after that it's gone, and they have no way of replacing it. They have no way of replacing any of this. So what are they going to do once they reach Melitopol? And I want to talk about something else. They get this close to Crimea. They start endangering Crimea. The Russian Federation, the population, the public sees this. And they're going to be angry, just like they were angry over the Kharkov and Kherson offensives. Actually, they'll be more angry because Crimea always has been, and most certainly is, Russian. And Russian people will perceive that as a much greater threat. And they will demand escalation. And this will give Moscow the political capital that it will need for another mobilization of trained manpower. It'll also give them the political capital to expand military industrial production and also mobilize the economy and industry to a much greater effect. In other words, the better Ukraine does in this offensive, the more political capital it'll give to Moscow to escalate. We've heard the West say many times that this is a war of choice for Russia, but we all know in reality this is self-preservation. The Russian government knows this. The Russian people understand this, and they're not going to give up just because they had a bad day following a Ukrainian offensive. That wasn't the case after Kharkov and Kherson, and it will not be the case after this offensive. And then finally, the New York Times article talks about low morale among Ukrainian troops, and it cites that Azov Nazi giving these new recruits 5 weeks of training, and this is what he says. He says, "We know how Russia fights, and we know how to counter it. Resilience is the ability to find new people to move forward." And it's really just throwing bodies at the problem, what they accuse Russia of doing. And this is a Azov Nazi saying this, that they know how Russia fights and they know how to counter it. Maybe they know that, but they don't have the means to do it. They demonstrated that in Mariupol. They lost. Azov Nazis lost in Mariupol. A lot of the Nazi groups fighting around Bakhmut have been decimated. And now he's going back in the battle with recruits that were trained for only 5 weeks. It does not bode well. Now I want to talk briefly about, because many others, including Alexander Mikuris and Alex Christoforou from the Duran, they've covered this. They've done an excellent job covering it. I want to talk about these supposedly leaked NATO war plans regarding the upcoming offensive. Ukraine war plans leak prompts Pentagon investigation. Classified documents detailing secret American and NATO plans have appeared on Twitter and Telegram. And the first time I saw this, I immediately thought they're either fake or NATO released them deliberately. The article says classified war documents detailing secret American and NATO plans for building up the Ukrainian military ahead of a planned offensive against Russia were posted this week on social media channels. Senior Biden administration officials said the Pentagon is investigating who may have been behind the leak of the documents, which appeared on Twitter and on Telegram, a platform with more than 500 million users that is widely available in Russia. The timing is very suspect. This is something that militaries have done in recent history. They release fake plans, so they hope their enemy sees these fake plans and actually buys them instead of doing their own intelligence gathering like they should be doing. Russia, in fact, has its own military intelligence capabilities, and they should be depending on those. And of course, things like this could possibly factor in. You know, you're gathering all kinds of information and you're trying to make a composite picture, taking everything into consideration, and you create different scenarios from the most pessimistic to the most optimistic, and you make sure you have a plan prepared for all of these possible scenarios. I'm sure that that's what Russia is doing. And something like this could be leaked, it could be altered, there's a whole array of possibilities, and it could be meant to reinforce other deceptions that are ongoing. false radio communication decoy units that are trying to give Russian intelligence analysts the impression that the attack is coming here, when in fact it's coming somewhere else. Ahead of D-Day in World War II, there was a lot of this, trying to convince the Germans that the landings would be on an entirely different part of the coast than where they eventually ended up. And something similar could be taking place right now. With everything that is at stake here, I would hope that Russia is preparing for the absolute worst, which includes actually NATO itself getting involved. A lot of the things that they have done, including the conservation of their forces and their air power, seem to suggest that they have that possibility in mind, that they're preparing ahead of time for it. And other things that they have done, both on the battlefield and politically, seem to suggest that they understand that threat and they are preparing for it. There's the possibility that the US, NATO, some sort of coalition of the willing could go in and create a buffer zone in Ukraine, just like the US and its allies did in Syria. This is a long-term conflict. It's not going to be over with this offensive, most likely. It's going to go on for years, and even if the offensive completely fails, the fighting will still continue, and the US and their allies will find ways to keep the fighting going, again, just like they've done in Syria, all the way up until this very day. They're still fighting in Syria, although obviously Russia and their allies have the upper hand. Russia is going to have to continue working on the ground in Ukraine, again, keeping long-term strategic victory in mind, even if it means sacrificing short-term political victories today. And when the offensive comes, the Ukrainian offensive comes, there is a possibility that Russia will lose territory, even lots of territory, to Ukrainian forces. But if you're keeping in mind that this is a war of attrition and not a war of territorial conquest, you will realize that Ukraine, by doing so, is actually accelerating their defeat, not fending it off. And one last thing I want to show, I've talked about this in the past. This is from the US government, USAID, and the International Republican Institute, which is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is funded by the US government. They both are. And this was Public Opinion Survey, residents of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. This was in 2013. And they were asking questions about, do you identify as Russian? Would you like to rejoin with the Russian Federation? Regardless of your passport, what do you consider yourself? 40% Russian, 15% Ukrainian, 24% Crimean. If Ukraine were able to enter only one international economic union, which entity should it be with? Only 17% the European Union. 53%, a majority, says the customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. How would you evaluate your attitude to the following entities? By far, Russia, 68% warm. European Union and the US and Poland and Turkey, you add them together, they don't match their feelings toward Russia. In your opinion, what should the status of Crimea be? And that, even in 2013, 23%, almost a quarter, say Crimea should be separated and given to Russia. And that was before the US overthrew the elected Ukrainian government in 2014, installed actual Nazis and their political allies into power, and then they had many more reasons to want to join the Russian Federation. What this poll is saying is that Crimea was and is Russian. The people genuinely want to be a part of Russia, and the US arming Ukraine to go in there and take Crimea as Ukrainian territory, you are obviously going against the will of the people living there. And this whole myth that the US and Ukraine are fighting for democracy and self-determination is rendered an illusion, an absolute, utter illusion. But what I thought was interesting was I figured they did that poll in 2013 because they knew what was happening, because they were planning it and a part of it. They surely had to have done a poll for the rest of Ukraine as well. So I found that one too. Public Opinion Survey, residents of Ukraine, August and September 2013, same US government-funded organizations. If Ukraine was able to enter only one international economic union, with whom should it be? And you can see how the European Union and the customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, it switches from year to year. And again, this is because the US was heavily invested in manipulating public perception. But there was a strong affinity for Russia. And this was across all of Ukraine, not just Crimea. Here, how would you evaluate your attitude toward the following entities? 50% warm for Russia. Again, more than the European Union, more than Poland, more than the United States. Language usually spoken at home. 40% Russian, 40% Ukrainian. Ukrainian and Russian equally. The idea that it must be the Kremlin manufacturing separatism in Ukraine, this is a falsehood. Ukraine had been a part of Russia throughout history. It was part of the Soviet Union. The people there speak Russian as much as they speak Ukrainian. They had an affinity for Russia. They also had desires, you could say, overly idealistic, but they also had desires to join the European Union. It was a nation spanning both worlds, and the United States could not accept Ukraine benefiting from both worlds. They forced Ukraine to pick, and this is what has happened to Ukraine. It has been destroyed. And my point here is that the United States is going to continue talking about how this is a foreign nation that has invaded Ukraine. And when you look at the US government's own polls in 2013, before the US overthrew the government a year later, you can see that this is more akin to a civil war than a foreign nation invading another. We do not know exactly when the Ukrainian offensive will begin. I agree with Alexander Mercouris of the Duran that it most certainly will take place. It's just a matter of when it will take place and what the outcome will be. Because we don't know the exact disposition of Russian and Ukrainian troops along the line of contact, it's impossible to even come to educated predictions of what may or may not happen. We have to wait for the fighting to begin, and as the fighting unfolds, we will be able to tell more and more about what the potential outcome of the fighting may be. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of the links that I referenced to, everything that I referenced in this video, the links are down below in the video description, as are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. I will never monetize my YouTube channel. If you see an ad pop up, feel free to skip it because it's not helping me out at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon to everyone who has been helping out month to month, or through one-time donations, or even if you're just sharing this work with others and getting the word out there. I greatly appreciate all of that. That's what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.